The year was 2347. Ambassador Claire Morrison stood before the United Earth Council for what she knew would be the last time. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, but inside her chest, something had broken that would never heal again. 3 days ago, she had watched her daughter die on a screen. Executed by creatures who thought mercy was a disease. 30 years. For 30 long years, humanity had reached out to the Velthari Dominion with open hands and hopeful hearts. Claire had dedicated her entire life to this mission of peace, believing that any species smart enough to travel between stars must also be wise enough to choose friendship over war. She had been wrong. The Velthari were an old race, older than human civilization by thousands of years. Their empire spread across 40 star systems, and they had built it on the bones of species they considered inferior. When their scout ships first detected human radio signals a century ago, they had marked Earth as a future resource, another young species to be broken and absorbed into their great machine. Commander. Daniel Hughes remembered the first contact mission like it was yesterday. He had been a young officer then, full of hope and excitement. His ship, the Horizon, had carried the best diplomats Earth could offer to meet the Velthari for the first time. They brought gifts of art and music, samples of human technology, and invitations to cultural exchange. The Velthari had listened to their speeches with expressions that Daniel would later learn to recognize as amusement. To them, humanity was like a small animal offering its paw to a predator. Cute, perhaps, but meaningless. The Dominion gave Earth 2 choices: submit and become a labor species working in Velthari mines and factories until the human race was used up and discarded, or refuse and be destroyed completely, wiped from the universe as if humanity had never existed. But humans were stubborn creatures. They chose a third option that the Velthari had not considered. They kept talking. Over the next 3 decades, Earth sent 847 separate diplomatic missions to Velthari space. Each one carried new proposals, new offers of trade and cooperation, new attempts to find common ground. Human ambassadors learned the Velthari language perfectly. They studied Velthari history and culture with dedication that impressed even their enemies. They searched for any crack in the wall of contempt that surrounded the Dominion. Dr. Samuel Price was the leading expert on Velthari psychology. He had spent 40 years trying to understand how they thought, what they valued, what might reach them. His office at the University of New Geneva was filled with Velthari texts and recordings. Every piece of information humanity had gathered about their would-be conquerors, his conclusion was simple and terrible. The Velthari respected only one thing: strength. Not the strength to defend or protect, but the strength to dominate and destroy. In their view of the universe, species were divided into predators and prey. Humanity's offers of peace only proved that humans belonged in the second category. But Samuel also discovered something else, something he shared only with the highest levels of Earth's government. The Velthari were not as united as they appeared. Their empire was held together by fear, not loyalty. The species they had conquered hated their masters with a passion that burned across generations. If someone could break the Velthari military, the whole Dominion would collapse like a house built on sand. Meanwhile, the raids began. At first, they were small. A Velthari ship would appear near a human colony, take a few prisoners, and disappear. Earth protested through diplomatic channels. The Velthari responded with silence or mockery. Then the raids grew larger. Entire settlements vanished. Ships carrying families to new colonies never arrived at their destinations. Each loss was another wound in humanity's heart, another test of their commitment to peace. Claire Morrison buried friends during those years. She attended memorials for colleagues who had died trying to reach the Velthari. She wrote letters to the families of people who had been taken and would never return. And still she kept trying, kept believing that somewhere in the Velthari soul there must be something that could respond to kindness. Her daughter, Catherine, had inherited her mother's faith. At 25, she was the youngest member of the diplomatic corps, brilliant and passionate and absolutely convinced that peace was possible. When she volunteered for the latest mission to the Velthari homeworld, Claire was proud. terrified but proud. The mission lasted 3 weeks. Catherine and her team presented a new proposal, the most generous yet. Humanity would share all its medical technology freely. They would help develop worlds that the Velthri had neglected. They would ask nothing in return except an end to the raids and a chance to live as neighbors. The Velthri High Council listened to the proposal in their great hall, a chamber built from the bones of a species they had exterminated 3,000 years ago. When Catherine finished speaking, the Supreme Archon rose from his throne and smiled. That smile would haunt every human. Who saw what happened next? The execution was broadcast across the entire Dominion. 32 human diplomats, including Catherine Morrison, were killed slowly and publicly. The Archon delivered a speech explaining that this was a lesson for all young species who thought they could approach the Velthri as equals. Mercy, he declared, was for the weak, and the weak existed only to serve or die. Claire watched the broadcast in her office, surrounded by 30 years of diplomatic records, 30 years of hope and effort and belief. She watched her daughter die with dignity, refusing to beg, refusing to break, and something inside Claire changed forever. That night she addressed the United Earth Council. The chamber was silent as she spoke, every representative listening to words that would change the course of human history. "We tried," she said. "For 30 years we tried everything we knew. We offered friendship and trade and cooperation. We buried our dead and sent more diplomats. We believed, against all evidence, that peace was possible." She paused, looking out at faces that reflected her own grief and rage. "We were not wrong to try. We will never be wrong to hope for peace. But hope is not all that we are. And today, I am asking this council to authorize something we have never done before." The lights dimmed, and images appeared on the screens around the chamber. Ships. Thousands of ships. Designs that no one outside the military had ever seen. Weapons that made Velthri technology look primitive. An army that had trained in secret for decades, waiting for a day that everyone prayed would never come. "The Velthri think they know what humanity is," Claire said. "They think we are soft, weak, easy prey. They have only seen one side of us. The side that builds and dreams and reaches out in hope." Her voice hardened into something cold and sharp. "It is time to show them the other side." The vote was unanimous. For the first time in human history, Earth declared war, not in anger, not in hatred, but in sorrow. They had tried peace with everything they had. Now they would try something else, and the galaxy would never be the same. What the Velthri never understood, what they could not have imagined in their darkest nightmares, was that humanity had never been naive. Behind every smile, behind every offer of peace, behind every diplomatic mission that seemed so hopeful and foolish, Earth had been preparing for the worst. Admiral Victor Grant had spent his entire career building something in secret. He was an old man now, his hair white and his face lined with decades of careful worry. But his mind was sharp as ever, and his hands were steady as he walked through the hidden shipyard buried deep inside an asteroid in the outer solar system. The shipyard was called Sanctuary. Though few people knew it existed, from the outside, the asteroid looked like any other dead rock drifting through space. Inside, it held the largest military construction facility humanity had ever built, and it was only one of 17 such facilities scattered across human space. Hidden in asteroid belts and gas giant moons in places the Velthri would never think to look. Victor remembered the day the project started 40 years ago. He had been a young captain then, sitting in a room with Earth's most senior military officers and political leaders. The first Velthri contact had just happened, and the diplomats were already planning their peace missions. "We will support the diplomatic effort completely," the president had said, "but we will not be caught unprepared. If peace fails, we must be ready." They called it contingency, a simple name for something that would take half a century to build. While ambassadors traveled to Velthri space with olive branches, engineers and scientists worked in secret to create weapons and ships unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Dr. Helen Carter led the weapons research division. She was a quiet woman with kind eyes and gentle hands. The sort of person you might expect to find teaching children or caring for the sick. Instead, she had designed instruments of destruction that would have terrified the engineers of any other species. Her breakthrough came from studying the wreckage of Velthari raider ships. Several had been shot down over the years, and their technology was recovered and analyzed. The Velthari used energy shields and plasma weapons, standard technology for a spacefaring civilization. Effective, reliable, well understood. Helen looked at this technology and saw its weaknesses. Human creativity, born from millennia of warfare against themselves, proved remarkably adaptable. Within a decade, her team had developed PED weapons that could punch through Velthari shields like they were made of paper. Within 2 decades, they had built shields that Velthari weapons could barely scratch. But weapons alone would not win a war. They needed ships to carry them, crews to operate them, and strategies to guide them. This is where Captain Nathan Brooks entered the story. Nathan was the first commander of the new class of warship, the Adamant. She was beautiful in a terrible way, all clean lines and hidden power. Unlike the clumsy Velthari battlecruisers, the Adamant was fast and agile. Designed by engineers who had studied every naval battle in human history and applied those lessons to the stars, the first time Nathan took her out for trials, he felt something he had not expected. Not pride or excitement, but sadness. This ship existed because peace might fail. Every system on board, every weapon and sensor and engine represented a hope abandoned. He prayed he would never have to use her in actual combat, but he trained his crew as if war was coming tomorrow. They drilled constantly, running simulations against Velthari tactics, finding weaknesses and exploiting them. By the time the Adamant was ready for service, her crew could destroy a Velthari battle group in their sleep. Meanwhile, intelligence officers worked to map every corner of the Velthari Dominion. Lieutenant Maria Santos was the best of them, a young woman with a gift for finding patterns where others saw only chaos. She spent years analyzing intercepted communications, studying Velthari troop movements, building a picture of their entire military structure. Her database grew to contain the location of every major Velthari military installation, every supply depot, every shipyard. She knew where their fleets were stationed and how quickly they could respond to threats. She identified the officers who were competent and the ones who had been promoted because of family connections rather than skill. Most importantly, Maria discovered the cracks in the Dominion's foundation, the conquered species who waited for any chance to rebel, the outlying systems that resented the homeworld's control, the supply lines that were stretched too thin, the border fortresses that were undermanned, the arrogance that made the Velthari blind to their own vulnerabilities. All of this information was carefully stored and updated, waiting for the day it might be needed. Across Earth and her colonies, a secret army grew. Young men and women volunteered for military service without knowing exactly what they were preparing for. They trained in isolated camps on distant moons, learning combat skills that humanity had refined over 10,000 years of bloody history. Sergeant Kevin Park taught close-quarters combat at one such camp on a moon of Jupiter. His students came from every nation on Earth, every colony in human space. They learned to fight in zero gravity and crushing pressure, in freezing cold and burning heat. They learned to never give up, never surrender, never stop fighting until the job was done. The Velthari think humans are soft, Kevin told each new class. They think we will break easily. They've never studied our history. They do not know about Thermopylae or Stalingrad or the Lunar Rebellion. They do not understand what we are capable of when our families are threatened. The public knew nothing of these preparations. The government maintained its commitment to peace. Most citizens believed the diplomatic missions were humanity's only strategy. This was intentional. If the Velthari learned about contingency, they might strike before humanity was ready. But the families of those who had been taken by Velthari raiders knew something was happening. They could see it in the eyes of military officers who visited them, the quiet confidence beneath the grief. Wait, those eyes seemed to say, justice is coming. On the day the final diplomatic mission was murdered, Admiral Grant stood in Sanctuary's command center and watched the broadcast with his officers. He saw the Velthari Archon smile as he killed Catherine Morrison and her colleagues. He heard the speech about mercy being weakness, Then he turned to his staff and spoke 4 words that had been waiting to be said for 40 years. Activate contingency. All stations, across human space, hidden shipyards opened their doors. Secret bases came to life. Thousands of ships that officially did not exist powered up their engines and prepared for war. An army that had trained in shadows stepped into the light. The Velthari had spent 3 decades mocking humanity's peace efforts. They had killed diplomats and raided colonies and laughed at every attempt at friendship. They believed they knew exactly what humans were. They were about to discover. How wrong they had been. The broadcast began without warning. Every screen in known space flickered and changed at the same moment. In the great halls of the Velthari Dominion, in the meeting chambers of neutral powers, on worlds that had never heard of Earth, the same image appeared. A human woman, standing alone against a dark background, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held no fear. Secretary. General Patricia Lane had practiced this speech 1,000 times in her mind. She had written it years ago, hoping it would never need to be delivered, praying that peace would succeed. Now the time for prayer was over, and the time for truth had arrived. She spoke calmly, without anger in her voice, without hatred or bitterness. Her words were translated instantly into every known language, reaching billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. My name is Patricia Lane. I speak for the people of Earth and her colonies. 3 billion human beings who have spent 30 years reaching out to the galaxy in friendship. She paused, letting those words settle. For 3 decades, we sent ambassadors to the Velthari Dominion. We came with gifts and proposals, with open hands and hopeful hearts. We believe that any species capable of building starships must also be capable of wisdom, of growth, of choosing cooperation over conflict. Behind her, images began to appear. The diplomatic missions, one after another. Ambassadors shaking hands with Velthari officials. Gifts being presented. Speeches being delivered. The faces of men and women who had dedicated their lives to peace. We did not come as conquerors or competitors. We asked only for the chance to be neighbors, to trade and learn and build together. We believed that the universe was large enough for all of us. The images changed. Raided colonies, empty and burning. Ships that never reached their destinations. Families torn apart. The faces of people who had been taken and never seen again. The Velthari answered our friendship with contempt. They raided our settlements and took our people. They laughed at our proposals and mocked our hope. And when we kept trying, kept believing that peace was possible, they decided to teach us a final lesson. The execution appeared on screen. Not the deaths themselves, but the moment before. 32 diplomats standing with dignity, refusing to beg, refusing to break. Catherine Morrison in the center, young and brave and beautiful. They broadcast the killing across their empire as entertainment. Their leader declared that mercy was for the weak, and that the weak existed only to serve or die. Patricia's voice remained steady, but something shifted in her expression. The warmth faded from her eyes, replaced by something older and harder. The Velthari believe they understand humanity. They think they have seen what we are. They have watched us reach out in hope for 30 years, and they have concluded that we are soft, that we are easy prey, that we will submit or be destroyed. She stepped forward. Closer to the camera, they are wrong. The background behind her changed. Ships appeared, hundreds of them, then thousands. Designs that no one outside Earth's military had ever seen. Sleek warships bristling with weapons. Carriers launching fighters in perfect formation. Battleships that dwarfed anything the Velthari had ever built. For 40 years, while our diplomats talked of peace, our engineers worked in secret. While we offered friendship with one hand, we prepared for war with the other. Not because we wanted conflict, because we knew it might be forced upon us. The fleet continued to grow on screen, emerging from hidden bases across human space. Viewers throughout the galaxy watched in stunned silence. This was not the humanity they knew. This was something else entirely. We have studied your technology, Velthari, and we have improved upon it. We have analyzed your tactics and found their weaknesses. We have mapped your empire and identified every vulnerable point. We have built weapons you cannot imagine and trained soldiers you cannot defeat. Patricia's voice dropped lower, harder. We tried peace. For 30 years we tried everything we knew. We buried our dead and kept talking. We absorbed your insults and kept hoping. We gave you every chance to choose a different path. The images shifted again. Now they showed the human fleet moving into formation, engines glowing, weapons powering up. Admiral Grant stood on his bridge, surrounded by officers ready for battle. Soldiers checked their equipment and landing craft. Pilots climbed into fighters. You have only seen one side of humanity. The side that builds and dreams and reaches out across the stars. The side that believes in peace and cooperation and the better angels of our nature. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Now you will meet the other side. The camera pulled back, revealing a wall of screens behind Patricia. Each one showed a different part of the human fleet, a different weapon system, a different army ready for war. The side that survived ice ages when other species died. The side that conquered plagues that should have wiped us out. The side that split the atom and touched the stars and never, in 10,000 years of recorded history, failed to rise when pushed too far. Her eyes seemed to look directly at the Velthari Archon, wherever he might be watching. You call mercy weakness. You believe that kindness is a flaw. You think the universe belongs to predators and prey exists only to be consumed. She shook her head slowly. You do not understand what we are. We are the species that helped enemies rebuild after wars. We are the species that created art and music and beauty in the darkest times. We are the species that chose hope over despair. Again and again, no matter how many times we were hurt.
Right.
Her voice hardened to steel.
It.
But we are also the species that burned cities and split continents. We are the species that turned every tool into a weapon and every challenge into a fight. We are the species that survived because we refused to die, because we fought with everything we had. Because surrender was never in our nature. The fleet on screen began to move. Ships forming into attack patterns, heading toward Velthari space. We tried peace. We meant it sincerely. We wanted nothing more than to live beside you as friends and neighbors. Patricia Lane leaned toward the camera one final time. Remember that? When your fleets burn and your fortresses fall, remember that we gave you every chance. Remember that you chose this. Remember that we came to you first with open hands, and you answered with blood. She straightened, her face calm and cold. Now you will face the consequences. Not with hatred, not with cruelty, but with the full strength of a species you never bothered to understand.
Oh.
The transmission ended. Across the Velthari Dominion, there was silence. In the halls of power, officials looked at each other with the first stirrings of fear. Unconquered worlds, enslaved species began to whisper in hope. The message had been delivered. War had begun. The Velthari, High Command, received the human broadcast with a mixture of confusion and amusement. In their great war room, surrounded by maps of their vast empire, the senior admirals watched the message and then looked at each other with expressions of disbelief. Impressive theater, said Fleet Admiral Keth, the oldest and most decorated of their commanders. But theater changes nothing. We have crushed dozens of species. What can one young civilization do against the might of the Dominion? His confidence was shared throughout the military. The Velthari had been conquering and absorbing other races for millennia. They had seen desperate speeches before, heard threats from species that were now extinct. Humanity would be no different. They believed this right up until the Battle of Kethrin Station. Kethrin was a border fortress. It's one of the largest military installations in the Dominion. It guarded the main approach to Velthari space, protected by a fleet of 200 warships and defensive platforms that could destroy anything that came within range. It had never been attacked, because no one was foolish enough to try. Captain Nathan Brooks brought the Adamant and her sister ships out of hyperspace at precisely calculated coordinates, appearing behind the defensive platforms where their weapons could not reach. The Velthari commanders had 11 minutes to realize that everything they knew about warfare was about to change. Human weapons struck the Velthary shields and pass through them like they did not exist. Dr. Helen Carter's innovations worked exactly as designed. The plasma barriers that had protected Velthary ships for centuries offered no resistance to human beam weapons. Ship after ship exploded in the darkness of space, their crews never understanding what had hit them. The Velthary tried to respond. Their weapons fired at the human ships, expecting to tear through hull plating and destroy the attackers. Instead, their shots scattered harmlessly against shields that absorbed or deflected everything they could throw in 11 minutes. Catherine's station fell. 200 Velthary warships were destroyed or disabled. The fortress itself was captured intact, its garrison stunned and disarmed before they could organize a defense. And the human fleet moved on without pausing, heading deeper into Dominion space. Admiral Victor Grant coordinated the campaign from his flagship, the Resolute. He had spent decades planning for this moment, running simulations and war games, preparing for every possible scenario. Now all that preparation was paying off. His strategy was precise and methodical. Human forces struck at military targets with surgical accuracy, using the intelligence that Lieutenant Maria Santos had gathered over the years. They knew exactly where to hit, exactly how the Velthary would respond, exactly how to counter every move. But what confused the Velthary most was not the military effectiveness of human forces. It was their restraint when human ships destroyed a Velthary warship. They immediately moved to rescue survivors floating in space. When human soldiers captured a base, they treated prisoners according to strict protocols, providing medical care and adequate food. When human forces approached civilian populations, they did not attack. They simply bypassed them and moved on to the next military target. This was not how war was supposed to work. In Velthary history, conquering species always descended into rage and atrocity. They burned and looted and killed without mercy, becoming no better than the Dominion itself. This was what the Velthary expected, what they were prepared for. Instead, they faced something they could not understand. An enemy that fought with terrible efficiency, but refused to become monsters. Lieutenant Commander Andrea Kim led a squadron of assault ships to a prison world called Kethos, according to Maria Santos's intelligence. This world held thousands of human captives, people who had been taken in raids over the past 3 decades. Some had been prisoners for 20 years or more. Andrea's ships destroyed the orbital defenses in 6 minutes. Her Marines landed at the main prison complex and moved through the facility with practice speed. The Velthary guards, expecting savage revenge, were shocked when the humans simply disarmed them and confined them to their barracks without violence. The prisoners were another matter. Many had been tortured, starved, worked nearly to death. They emerged blinking into the light, unable to believe what they were seeing. Human soldiers. Human ships. Freedom. After years of believing they had been forgotten, Andrea found a woman who had been captured in the first raids. 30 years ago. She was old now, her body broken by decades of abuse, but her eyes lit up when she saw the human uniforms. "You came," she whispered. "After all this time, you actually came. We never forgot you," Andrea told her. "Not one of you. We built all of this for you, for everyone they took. It just took us a while to be ready." Ships carried the freed prisoners home. Tens of thousands of people reunited with families who had never stopped hoping. It was not a military victory in the traditional sense, but it mattered more than any battle. Meanwhile, the Velthary Empire began to crack from within. The conquered species who had lived under Dominion rule for generations saw what was happening. They saw the mighty Velthary losing battle after battle. They saw human forces treating prisoners with dignity instead of cruelty. They saw a different way. On world after world, rebellions broke out. Slaves refused to work. Soldiers mutinied against their officers. Supply lines collapsed as subject species stopped cooperating with their masters. The empire that had seemed so invincible was hollow at its core, held together only by fear. And now that fear was being replaced by hope. Dr. Helen Carter watched the battle reports from her laboratory on Earth. Her weapons worked perfectly. Her shields held against everything the Velthary could throw. She should have felt satisfaction, perhaps even pride. Instead, she felt only sorrow. Every destroyed ship meant lives lost. even enemy lives. Every battle was a failure of the piece she had hoped would succeed. She had built these weapons because they were necessary, not because she wanted to use them. Was there any other way? Her assistant asked one evening. Helen thought about the question for a long time before answering. We tried every other way. For 30 years we tried. They chose this. All we could do was be ready when they did. Within 6 months, the Velthari military was broken. Their great fleets were scattered debris. Their fortress worlds had fallen one by one. Their conquered territories had slipped away, liberated by human forces or freed by their own rebellions. The dominion that had terrorized the galaxy for millennia collapsed like a house of cards. It had been built on fear and cruelty, and when those foundations were swept away, nothing was left to hold it together. The human fleet gathered in orbit around the Velthari homeworld. Below them lay the heart of the Empire. The world where the Archon had smiled as he killed Catherine Morrison and her colleagues. Weapons were charged and ready. The war could end with a single command. Admiral Grant looked at his tactical display and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The decades of preparation, the friends he had lost, the hopes that had been betrayed. His finger hovered over the command. That would begin the final bombardment. Then he lowered his hand and gave a different order. Hold position. All ships maintain defensive stance. No one fires unless fired upon. His officers looked at him with surprise, but they obeyed. The fleet waited in silence, weapons ready, but still. It was time for humanity to make a choice. The Velthari home. World turned slowly beneath the human fleet, blue and green and beautiful despite everything its people had done. From orbit, it looked peaceful, a garden world that had given birth to a civilization old enough to remember. When most other species were still learning to make fire, Admiral Victor Grant stood on the bridge of the Resolute and stared at that world for a long time. His fleet had the power to turn it into ash. A single order. The species that had killed human diplomats and raided human colonies and laughed at human hopes would cease to exist. Justice, by any reasonable measure. But Victor had not spent his life building this fleet for justice. He had built it for something harder and more complicated. He had built it for choice. Secretary General Patricia Lane arrived 3 days later, traveling aboard a small diplomatic ship that seemed tiny and fragile beside the warships that surrounded it. She came alone, without guards or advisors, carrying only a small case and the weight of human history on her shoulders. Victor met her in the shuttle bay. They had known each other for decades. Two people who had dedicated their lives to preparing for a day they hoped would never come. Are you sure about this? He asked. Patricia looked out at the stars beyond the shuttle bay doors. We fought this war to prove we could. Now we need to prove we can stop. She took a shuttle down to the surface, landing in the central plaza of the Velthari capital city. No weapons fired at her. No one tried to stop her. The Velthari were too shocked, too broken, too confused to do anything but watch as this small human woman walked through their streets. The city was old. Older than human civilization by thousands of years. Its buildings were made from stone that had stood since before humans learned to write. Its streets had been walked by beings who remembered when Earth was just another primitive world, with no future worth mentioning. Patricia walked past citizens who stared at her with expressions she could not read. Fear, certainly, confusion, but also something else, something that might have been curiosity. They had been told all their lives that other species were inferior, weak, fit only to serve or die. Now one of those inferior beings was walking among them, alone and unafraid. After destroying everything they believed in, the Great Hall of the Velthari government was a monument to conquest. Its walls were decorated with trophies from 100 defeated species. Its columns were carved from the bones of races that no longer existed. Its throne was built on the foundation of suffering that stretched back millennia. The surviving Velthari leaders waited for her there. Gathered in the same chamber where they had once laughed at human diplomats, the Supreme Archon was dead, killed in the final battle for the homeworld. His replacement was an old female named Velith, who had risen to power not through cruelty, but through simple survival. Velith watched Patricia approach the throne with ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. She expected demands for surrender, for reparations, for the humiliation that conquerors always imposed on the conquered. She expected to see in this human's face the same hunger for domination that had driven the Velthari themselves. Patricia stopped before the throne and looked up at the assembled leaders. She did not kneel. She did not bow. She simply stood there, one small human against the weight of a civilization that had once ruled the stars. "You expected us to destroy you," Patricia said. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent hall. "To burn your cities and enslave your people. To become what you were?" Velith said nothing. The other leaders shifted nervously. "That is not who we are. That was never who we are." Patricia opened the case she carried and removed a single document printed on paper in the old style. She placed it on the table before the throne. "This is a treaty. I wrote it myself, with input from our military commanders and civilian leaders. It offers terms that I believe are fair." Belith looked at the document, but did not touch it. "What do you want from us?" "Your military will be dismantled. Your weapons will be destroyed. The species you conquered will be freed and given the right to determine their own futures. Those of your people who committed crimes against other races will face justice." Patricia paused, letting those conditions sink in. "But your world will remain yours. Your people will not be harmed. Your culture will survive. Your children will grow up in peace, free to build a new future that does not depend on conquest and cruelty." Belith stared at her. "Why?" It was a simple question, but it contained everything. Why show mercy to those who had shown none? Why spare a species that had killed and enslaved and destroyed without remorse? Why offer peace to creatures who had laughed at peace for 30 years? Patricia thought about her answer carefully. This was the moment that would define humanity in the eyes of the galaxy. Whatever she said now would echo through history, because this is what we are, she finally said. "We can wage war like no species you have ever seen. Our history is written in blood, and we have never lost when our survival was at stake. But that is not all we are. That is not even most of what we are." She gestured at the hall around them, at the trophies of conquest and the monuments to cruelty. "You built your civilization on fear and domination. You believed that strength meant the power to destroy, and weakness meant the willingness to show mercy. You thought the universe was divided into predators and prey, and you were proud to be predators." Patricia shook her head slowly. "We believe something different. We believe that true strength is not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice not to. We believe that mercy is not weakness, but the hardest kind of courage. We believe that any species can burn worlds and kill enemies. Only the strongest can choose to build instead." She looked directly into Velith's ancient eyes. "We tried peace first. For 30 years we tried with all our hearts. You rejected our friendship and killed our people and forced us to become warriors. We did not want this war. We did not enjoy it. We fought because you gave us no other choice." Her voice softened slightly. "Now we have a choice again. We can destroy you and prove that we are exactly what you always believed. It's just another species that conquers and kills and takes what it wants. Or we can show you, and the whole galaxy, that there is another way." She gestured at the treaty. "This is our choice. Not revenge. Not domination. Peace, offered from a position of absolute strength. Mercy granted not because we are weak, but because we are strong enough to afford it." Velith reached out and touched the document. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the terms. It was exactly what Patricia had described. Fair. Harsh in some ways, certainly, but not cruel. Not the treaty of a conqueror, but the treaty of someone who wanted to end a war, not start an empire. "If we refuse?" Velith asked. Patricia did not threaten. She did not need to. The fleet in orbit was threat enough. "Then we will do what we must. But I hope you will not refuse. I hope you will choose to be part of a different future, one where strength is measured not by how much you can destroy, but by how much you can build." The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Velith picked up a pen and signed the treaty. The war was over. News of the peace spread across the galaxy faster than light. Species that had watched the conflict with fear and fascination learned that humanity had not become another Velthari. They had won complete victory and then offered mercy. They had proven they could destroy anything and then chosen to build instead, in the years that followed. Human diplomats traveled to every corner of known space. This time, they were not laughed at. This time, when they spoke of cooperation and trade and friendship, other species listened. Not because humanity was feared, though it was, because humanity had proven something the galaxy had forgotten, that true strength was not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice not to. Claire Morrison lived long enough to see the first Velthari ambassador arrive on Earth. 50 years after her daughter's death, she watched from the gallery as he presented credentials and spoke awkwardly of new beginnings and shared futures. He was young, born after the war. Innocent of the crimes his people had committed. Claire thought about Catherine, about all the diplomats who had died trying to make peace. They would have been proud, she realized. They had always believed that peace was possible, even when it seemed hopeless. They were right. It just took longer than anyone expected. The ambassador finished his speech and looked up at the gallery. Someone had told him about Claire, about what her family had sacrificed. Their eyes met for a moment, and he bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement of a debt that could never be repaid. Claire nodded back. There was no anger in her anymore, no desire for revenge. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her daughter's death had meant something, that all those years of trying had finally led to this moment. Humanity returned to what it did best, building, dreaming, reaching out across the stars with hope. But they never forgot how to fight, and neither did anyone else. And that, perhaps, was the final message. Peace was always the goal. But peace only lasted when those who wanted it were strong enough to defend it. Humanity learned that lesson the hard way. The galaxy would not forget it.